My son threw me out, then came to claim the land that saved me.
At 70 years old, Winifred Calloway stood barefoot on the frost-covered driveway of a house she had helped build from nothing, holding a suitcase that contained what remained of her life. The cold pressed through the soles of her feet and moved upward through her bones the way cold always does when it has nowhere else to go. Behind her, the front door had just closed, not slammed. That would have required feeling. It simply closed the way you close a drawer you are finished with. Through the narrow window beside the door, she could see the shape of her son, Douglas, moving back into the warmth of the kitchen. His wife, Petra, stood at the counter, pouring herself a glass of wine. Her posture relaxed, her movements unhurried. Neither of them looked out. There was no final glance, no hesitation. Winifred had already been accounted for and set aside the way you handle something that has outlived its purpose. She stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, not because she was waiting for Douglas to change his mind. She already understood that nothing was going to change. She stood there because she was giving herself the last few seconds to memorize what this felt like. The temperature of the air, the silence of the neighborhood, the particular quality of darkness that surrounded a house full of light when you are no longer welcome inside it. She wanted to remember it exactly. She did not want to soften it later. The street was quiet. Porch lights glowed amber along the block, but no doors opened. No neighbors appeared. Winifred had lived in proximity to these people for 4 years, and not one of them had learned her name. She picked up the suitcase handle with both hands and turned away from the house. That was when she saw it. At the far edge of the driveway, where the concrete met the dark shoulder of the road, a cat sat watching her. It was gray and black, its coat the color of shadows layered over shadows, and its eyes caught the distant light in a way that made them look fixed and deliberate. It did not move when she noticed it. It did not run. It simply sat watching her with an expression that contained neither judgment nor pity, only attention. Winifred looked at it for a moment. She was 70 years old, standing alone on a frozen driveway at 10 in the evening with a suitcase and no destination. She had no money in her wallet beyond a few folded bills. She had no phone charger packed because she had not been given enough time to think clearly when she packed. She had a sister in Nashville named Nadine who had warned her this was coming and whom she had dismissed with the particular certainty of someone who does not want to be right. She had nowhere to go. The cat turned and began walking forward, not away from her, but along the road, moving toward the dark stretch where the streetlights thinned and the houses gave way to the edge of something older and less organized. If you have ever been the person in the room who everyone else speaks around rather than to, if you have ever signed something you did not fully understand because the person handing you the pen was your own child, and you believed that love was the same as safety, if you have ever stood outside a door that used to be yours and understood in your body what your mind was still refusing to accept, then you already know something about what Winifred Calloway felt on that driveway. And you already know why she followed the cat. She followed it because there was nothing left behind her worth turning back for. Winifred had not always been invisible. There was a time not so distant that she could not still feel the edges of it when her name meant something inside a household. It meant the smell of coffee before sunrise. It meant the sound of a problem being solved quietly before anyone else woke up to find it. It meant a woman who had measured her life not in personal ambitions, but in the stability she provided for someone who needed her. Her son Douglas had been the center of that world since the day he was born. She had built everything around him, not because she lacked her own desires, but because the desire to see him become something solid and good had overtaken all the others so gradually that she had not noticed the displacement until it was complete. His father left when Douglas was 5 years old. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument that could be pointed to later as the breaking point. One morning there was a man in the house, and then there was not, and Winifred spent approximately 3 days allowing herself to feel the full weight of that before she decided that feeling it would have to wait until there was more time. There was never more time. She worked 2 jobs through most of Douglas's childhood. Waitressing in the mornings at a diner on the edge of Knoxville that smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee. Cleaning office buildings at night, moving through empty fluorescent corridors with a mop in the particular solitude of someone doing necessary work that no one will ever acknowledge. There were winters when the heating unit in their small house broke down and she told Douglas it was an adventure to sleep in extra layers. There were summers when the electricity was cut for a week and she told him the candles were for atmosphere. Douglas never knew how close they came to losing everything. More than once. Winifred made sure of that. A child should not have to carry the weight of a parent's fear. She believed that completely, and she lived it, and it cost her in ways she was only beginning to understand standing on that driveway. She remembered the evening Douglas came home at 17 with something bright and restless moving behind his eyes. He paced the small living room while he talked, gesturing with his hands, describing a business he wanted to build, something of his own, something that would prove that the Callaway name meant more than struggle and early mornings and making do. "I do not want to spend my life working the way you have, Mom," he said. He did not mean it cruelly. She understood that even then. He meant it as ambition, as a promise to himself. But something inside her chest tightened when he said it, a small recognition of something she chose not to examine too closely. "You will do more than I ever could," she told him. She meant it. She believed it down to the center of herself. Years later, when Douglas stood in her living room with a folder of business plans and projections in a particular kind of nervous energy that reminded her of that 17-year-old boy, Winifred did not hesitate. He explained the opportunity, the market gap, the potential, the need for starting capital. He said, "Once it takes off, you will never have to worry about anything again." He looked at her with eyes that still had some of that 17-year-old brightness in them. Winifred looked around the room that contained her entire life. The worn couch, the photographs along the wall, the small garden visible through the back window where she had grown tomatoes for 11 years. Every sacrifice she had ever made lived inside these walls. She sold it, all of it. Every dollar went into Douglas's dream. "Are you certain about this?" her sister Nadine asked over the phone. Her voice carried the particular weight of someone choosing words carefully. "That is everything you have, Winnie." "He is everything I have," Winifred said. And at the time, standing in the emptied house with the closing papers still warm in her hands, it felt like the truest thing she had ever said. The business grew. Slowly at first, then with a momentum that surprised even Douglas. Contracts came in, staff was hired. Winifred moved into the new house in the quiet suburban neighborhood outside Knoxville, the one with wide windows and floors that did not creak, and a guest room that was designated for her from the beginning, though it never quite felt like it was for her. For a while, she allowed herself to rest. She had not rested in 30 years, not properly. Not the kind of rest that comes from knowing that the immediate danger has passed. She sat in the garden of the new house and drank her morning coffee and told herself that this was what she had worked toward, not for herself, but for Douglas, having the kind of life where a person could simply sit in a garden and drink coffee. Then Petra arrived. It did not happen suddenly. Looking back, Winifred could see the architecture of it clearly, the careful, patient way things were rearranged. But it happened slowly enough that at the time, each small change seemed reasonable. Petra was polished and self-possessed, with a smile she deployed with precision and a way of speaking to Winifred that was almost warm if you did not listen too carefully to the spaces between the words. "Winifred, you have done so much already. You should rest now. Let us handle things. Winifred, we are having colleagues over for dinner tonight. It might be more comfortable for you upstairs. Winifred, have you thought about what arrangements might suit you better at this stage of your life?" Each sentence reasonable. Each sentence a door closing. The evening Winifred understood what was actually happening. She had come downstairs to refill her water glass and found Douglas and Petra entertaining two people she did not recognize. She stood in the doorway of her son's kitchen and heard Petra tell the guests in a tone that was light and practiced and entirely casual that Winifred was a family friend who had helped out in the early days and was staying on for a little while longer. Not his mother, a family friend who had helped out. Douglas was sitting 18 inches away. He heard every word. He looked at the table. Winifred filled her glass and went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room that had her things in it but did not feel like her room, and she understood with a clarity that required no further evidence that she had been reclassified. She was no longer the foundation of this family. She was a liability that had not yet been fully addressed. She called Nadine the next morning. Nadine answered immediately, which meant she had been waiting. "There are papers I signed," Winifred said. "Months ago, legal paperwork about the house and the business structure." Petra said it was organizational. "I know," Nadine said. The pause that followed was long enough to contain everything Nadine did not say. Winifred asked her sister to find out what the papers meant. Nadine called back 48 hours later and spoke in the careful tone of someone delivering a diagnosis. The documents transferred all residential rights to Douglas and Petra jointly. What Winifred had understood as organizational paperwork had been in practice a complete relinquishment of any legal standing she held in the household. She had signed herself out of her own home. "I told you," Winnie, Nadine said softly. "I told you to look more carefully before you signed." "You did," Winifred said. "You believed in him more than you believed in the evidence in front of you." "I always have," Winifred said. The argument that followed was not a fight exactly. It was more like the sound of two truths colliding. Nadine believed in clear eyes and the protection that comes from refusing to be willfully blind. Winifred believed in loyalty and the idea that love meant absorbing uncertainty rather than guarding against it. Both of them were right about something. The collision left them speaking less for several weeks, and Winifred spent those weeks watching the household around her with the particular attention of someone who now understood exactly what they were watching. The night Petra said the thing she had been building toward for months, Douglas was standing close enough to touch. "Winifred, these arrangements are not sustainable long-term. We need to think about what makes sense going forward." Winifred looked at her son. Douglas exhaled slowly. "Mom, things are different now. You have to understand that." She waited. She gave him every possible second to say something that contradicted what she was hearing. He did not use those seconds. He looked at the floor and then at his wife, and the choice was visible and complete. Winifred went upstairs and packed what she could carry. She had been standing on the driveway for perhaps 4 minutes when the cat appeared. Now she had been following it for what felt like much longer than the distance covered suggested. The neighborhoods had thinned. The sidewalk had ended. The road had narrowed and then surrendered to packed earth, and the trees had thickened on both sides until the sound of the city had been absorbed completely, and there was nothing left but the crunch of her suitcase wheels on uneven ground and the faint movement of the cat ahead of her. She was thinking without intending to about a pair of hands. She did not know why. It was the kind of thought that arrives without invitation, surfacing from somewhere below the level of deliberate memory. A man's hands, large and work-roughened, with calluses across the palm that came from years of doing something real. She had a sense of those hands without a face to attach them to, without a name or a context. Only the hands and a voice saying something she could almost hear. Something about what your hands make being yours in a way nothing else is. She let the thought sit without examining it. It felt important, but she could not have explained why, and she was too cold and too tired to push at something her mind was not ready to open. She stored it the way you store a detail that does not yet have a category in the back of awareness, where things wait until they are needed. The second time she fell, she did not get up right away. Her foot caught a root she had not seen in the dark, and she went down hard, her palm hitting the ground, first the suitcase toppling beside her. She lay with her cheek against the cold, damp earth and looked at the underside of the trees against the dark sky and thought with a flatness that was not quite despair, but was close enough to be concerning that this was a reasonable place to stop. She was 70 years old. She had given everything she had to someone who had used it and then set her aside without ceremony. The cold was inside her coat now. Her feet hurt. Her hands were muddy and shaking. No one knew where she was. No one was coming. Then something warm pressed against her hand. Winifred turned her head slowly. The cat had come back. It was sitting beside her close enough that she could feel a faint heat coming from its small body, and it was looking at her with the same fixed, particular attention it had offered from the beginning. Not pity, not urgency, something more like acknowledgement, like it was bearing witness. She stared at it for a moment. "You came back," she said. Her voice sounded unfamiliar in the dark, rougher than she expected. The cat did not move. What Winifred felt in that moment was not warmth or comfort in any conventional sense. It was something more basic. A small living thing had returned to where she was when she was down. That was all. But that was not nothing. In fact, in that particular darkness, it was the only thing that was not nothing. She pushed herself up slowly, her joints announcing their opinions one by one. She reached for the suitcase and used it to lever herself to standing. She stood in the dark, breathing carefully, letting her body recalibrate. "I cannot stop," she said, not to the cat, not to anyone, because stopping means I am done, and I am not done. She did not entirely believe that yet, but she said it, and saying it out loud in the dark forest gave it slightly more weight than it had before. The cat turned and continued forward. The path changed beneath her feet as she walked. What had been barely visible became more defined, as though it had known traffic once long ago and retained the memory of it. The trees shifted, opening slightly around a natural clearing, and Winifred slowed without meaning to because her eyes had caught something that did not belong to the forest. A structure. It emerged from the dark and the overgrowth, the way certain things emerge when your eyes adjust, not suddenly but in layers, each moment of looking revealing more detail than the moment before. Wooden walls weathered to the color of old bone. Windows clouded by years of accumulated grime. A roof that sagged at one end under the weight of seasons. Vines had made the exterior their own, threading between the boards and along the sills in the patient way that growing things reclaim what has been abandoned. It was not a ruin. It was a place that had been used and then left and had endured the leaving. There is a difference, and Winifred understood it even before she was close enough to touch the door. The cat crossed the clearing without hesitation and stopped at the entrance, looking back at her, once its eyes catching some source of light that Winifred could not identify. She moved toward it slowly. Up close, the cabin had details she had not seen from a distance. Marks on the doorframe at a specific height, the kind left by a hand that has opened the same door thousands of times in the same way. A wooden peg driven into the wall beside the door at a practical angle, the kind of thing a person puts up on a specific afternoon because they are tired of having nowhere to hang their coat. Evidence of intention. Someone had lived here not as a temporary measure but as a choice. Winifred placed her hand against the door. The wood was rough and cold and absolutely real. She pushed. The hinges resisted briefly as though surprised and then gave way with a sound that was less a creak than a voice clearing itself after a long silence. A breath of stale air moved past her, carrying the smell of old wood and closed rooms, and beneath that something she could not immediately identify. She stepped inside. The interior was exactly what the exterior had prepared her for. Worn and still and full of the particular quiet that accumulates in places where no one has spoken in a long time. A table near the center, a fireplace on the far wall, cold and dark, a shelf with a few remaining objects, a tin cup, a ceramic bowl with a crack along one side, a stack of books whose titles had faded past legibility. A coat hung on a peg near the back wall, its fabric stiff with age. Winifred moved through the space, slowly touching nothing, only looking. Someone had organized this. The shelf was not haphazard. The table was positioned deliberately in relation to the window. The coat was on the peg rather than draped over the chair because the person who put it there preferred order. She could read the habits of a person in the way they arranged the objects of their daily life. And what she read here was someone careful, patient, and alone. The cat moved past her down the narrow hallway to the back room. She followed. The back room was smaller, a narrow bed with a faded covering, a side table with uneven legs, and in the corner, a chest. It was made of dark wood reinforced with bands of rusted metal, and it sat in the corner with the particular weight of something that has been placed exactly where it is supposed to be. A lock hung at the front, thick and unmoving. Everything else in the room had the worn quality of things that had been regularly used. The chest looked protected. Winifred crossed to it and crouched down, her knees protesting the angle. She touched the lock. Cold, rough, immovable. She sat back slightly and looked at the room again, the way you look at a room when you suspect you are missing something. The cat jumped onto the side table and sat looking at her. Not at the chest, at her. Winifred frowned and looked at the floor. There. One of the planks near the foot of the bed sat at a slightly different level than the ones around it. Not dramatically, just enough. The kind of difference you would not see unless you were looking, and you would not look unless something directed your attention there. She shifted forward and pressed her fingers into the narrow gap at the plank's edge. It lifted without resistance, as though it had been lifted many times before and remembered how. In the hollow beneath, wrapped in a square of cloth that had once been dark blue and was now simply old, was something small and solid. Winifred lifted it out and set it on the floor in front of her. She unfolded the cloth with both hands slowly, the way you handle something you understand to be significant without yet knowing why. Inside, a key, old and rusted and absolutely real. And beneath the key, a photograph. She picked up the photograph and held it toward the faint light coming through the grimy window. The image was faded, its edges curled and soft the way old photographs go when they have been handled and then stored and then forgotten for a very long time. But the two figures in it were clear enough. A woman standing beside a man, both facing the camera, both caught in a moment of ease that the camera had preserved while everything around it had continued moving and changing and eventually becoming unrecognizable. The woman was her, not as she was now, but as she had been. Younger, straighter, with something in her eyes that she had stopped seeing in the mirror so long ago. She had stopped looking for it. An openness, the expression of someone who has not yet learned to brace for impact. And the man beside her, Winifred looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her chest, deep and slow, like something that had been locked in place for years, shifting almost imperceptibly in its housing. His face was calm and specific. The face of someone who did not need to perform anything for the camera, who was simply there in the way some people are simply there without apology or arrangement. She knew him. She was completely certain she knew him and completely unable to access his name. It sat just beyond the reach of her memory, the way a word sits on the tip of the tongue, present and inaccessible at the same time. She could feel the shape of knowing without being able to open it. "Who are you?" she said quietly. The cat was still watching her. The room was very still. Winifred sat on the cold wooden floor of a cabin she had never visited, holding a photograph of herself standing beside a man she knew and could not name, with a key in her hand and a locked chest in the corner, and the growing understanding that none of this was accidental. Not the cat, not the path, not the hidden plank, not the photograph of a woman who looked like the person she used to be before she learned to make herself smaller. Something had led her here, and whatever was inside that chest was not merely old and forgotten. It had been waiting, and it had been waiting specifically for her. The key fit the lock perfectly. That was the first thing, not the sound it made, not the resistance of metal that had not moved in years, but the simple, undeniable fact that a key hidden under a floorboard in a cabin she had never visited fit a lock on a chest she had never seen, as though the two had been waiting for each other, with the particular patience of things that know they will eventually be reunited. Winifred knelt on the cold floor and turned the key slowly. The mechanism ground against itself, decades of stillness compressed into a few seconds of resistance, and then something released inside it with a sound like a held breath, finally let go. The lock fell open in her hand. She did not open the chest immediately. She stayed kneeling on the floor with the open lock in her palm and looked at the lid and understood that whatever was on the other side of it was going to change the shape of something. She did not know what yet, but she had lived long enough to recognize the feeling of standing at a threshold where the world on one side is measurably different from the world on the other. And this was that feeling. Sitting in the floor of a cold back room in an abandoned cabin in the Tennessee woods at what she estimated was somewhere past midnight. She set the lock aside and lifted the lid. The smell that came out was old paper and cedar and time. Inside, arranged with a care that suggested they had been placed there deliberately and not simply stored, were documents. Stacked. Organized. Winifred reached in and lifted the top layer and held it toward the window, where the faint gray of approaching morning had begun to separate the glass from the dark beyond it. Legal language. Dense and precise. Her eyes moved across the text without fully parsing it, at first the way eyes move across something that the mind is not yet prepared to accept. Then certain phrases began to surface and hold. Her name, Winifred Ann Calloway, repeated across multiple pages with the specificity of legal documentation not mentioned but named, claimed, designated. Property records, land boundaries, coordinates that meant nothing to her in the abstract, but which corresponded, she understood, with growing certainty to the ground she was kneeling on and the walls around her and the trees she had walked through to get here. She turned pages. Her breath had become very shallow. "This belongs to me," she said. The words came out quietly, almost carefully, as though she was testing their weight before committing to them. But they were not a question. The documents were unambiguous. This land, this cabin, this forgotten place at the end of a path that no map she had ever seen included, had been legally designated as hers. Not recently. The dates on the paperwork reached back decades. She sat back against the side of the bed and held the papers in her lap and looked at them for a long time. Beneath the documents, when she reached back into the chest, her hand found something else. A bundle of notebooks. 4 of them, their covers faded to an indeterminate brown, tied together with a piece of cord that had dried and stiffened with age. She lifted them out and set them on the floor beside the documents and looked at them. She picked up the top one and opened it. The handwriting inside was steady and deliberate, each letter formed with care, the writing of someone who understood that these words might be read by someone important and wanted them to be legible. Winifred looked at the first line and her throat tightened before her mind had finished processing what her eyes were reading. If you are reading this, then somehow against all odds you found your way here. She stopped. Read it again. The sentence was addressed to her, not in the general sense of a journal entry that might theoretically be read by anyone. Addressed to her, specifically written for her left here, in the expectation or, at minimum, the hope that she would one day be exactly where she was right now, sitting on the floor of this back room with this notebook in her hands. She turned to the signature at the bottom of the first page. Arthur Hess. The name struck her somewhere below thought in the part of the body that remembers things the mind has buried. She said it out loud without meaning to, just the name. Just those two words spoken into the stillness of the cabin, and something happened when she heard her own voice say it. A door opened somewhere inside her, not all at once. The way a door opens when the house is settled and the frame has warped, and you have to lean into it with your shoulder before it gives. Arthur Hess, she knew that name. She had always known that name. But somewhere in the long process of surviving her life, she had allowed it to be covered over by everything that came after, the way a road gets covered by new construction, until the original surface is no longer visible, but is still there, still solid, still running, exactly where it always ran. She began to read. He wrote the way he apparently did everything else, without ornamentation, without performance. He wrote about the summer they had met, the specific afternoon on a road outside Knoxville, where the light came through the trees at an angle that made everything look like it was lit from inside. He wrote about the particular quality of her laugh, which he described as the kind of laugh that makes the people around it feel like they have been let in on something. He wrote about a future they had talked about in the easy, assuming way of two people who have not yet learned that the future is not actually theirs to plan. Then he wrote about the day she was gone. No goodbye, he wrote, no letter. I went to the house and her father came to the door. He told me she had chosen a different direction, that she had asked not to be contacted. He was calm about it. He was a calm man in general, her father. The kind of man who delivers difficult information without raising his voice because he believes the delivery method reflects well on him, regardless of the content. Winifred's grip on the notebook tightened. I did not believe him entirely, Arthur wrote, but I also had no way to know what was true. I wrote to her anyway, every week for the first year, every month for the 3 years after that. I addressed every letter to the house I knew and sent them and waited. They all came back. Every single one unopened, the envelope still sealed. She put the notebook down on her knee and looked at the far wall for a moment. The gray light through the window had strengthened slightly. The cat was somewhere behind her. She could hear the small sound of it shifting its weight. 50 letters, she said quietly. She had never received a single one. She picked the notebook back up. I understood eventually Arthur wrote that someone was intercepting the letters before they reached her. I could not prove it, and I had no leverage to press the question. What I knew was that she was not reading my words, and she was not going to read them through any channel her family controlled. Winifred turned the page. What happened next was the thing that undid her composure entirely. Not because it was dramatic, because it was so completely in keeping with who Arthur Hess had apparently been that it felt both entirely surprising and entirely inevitable at the same time. He built something. He wrote about it plainly, without ceremony. He had found this land through a sale that most people overlooked because it was remote and had no immediate commercial value and required more clearing work than anyone with easy options would bother with. He bought it. He spent his weekends and his evenings and eventually most of his savings on it. He built the cabin with his own hands over the course of 3 years, working slowly and carefully because he wanted it to last, because he wanted it to be real in a way that letters being returned could not diminish. I did not know if you would ever need it, he wrote, but I needed my hands to have something to do. When my hands had something to do, I felt like I was still keeping a promise to someone, even if that person did not know the promise existed. Winifred set the notebook down on the floor and pressed both hands flat against the wooden planks and breathed. She had spent 40 years believing a story about Arthur Hess that had been constructed for her without her knowledge or consent. She had believed he left. She had believed he chose something else, someone else, that she had been a chapter in a story that continued without her. She had built her entire subsequent life on the foundation of that belief. And that belief had been a lie told to her by her father in the calm, certain voice of a man who believed he was protecting her from something he had decided she should not have. The grief that moved through her in that moment was not the grief of loss. It was something more disorienting than that. It was the grief of understanding that the loss itself had been manufactured, that she had mourned something that had not ended, that somewhere in the same city where she had been raising Douglas alone and working double shifts and telling herself that some things simply do not work out. Arthur Hess had been building this cabin with his hands and writing her letters that never arrived. She stayed on the floor for a long time. The light in the room changed around her as morning came in properly, filling the grimy windows with gray and then pale gold. Eventually she stood. Her body ached from the cold floor and the long night and the particular physical weight of an emotional reckoning, which is heavier than most people acknowledge. She moved to the main room and looked at the fireplace and understood practically that she needed warmth before she could think clearly about anything else. She found wood stacked in an alcove near the back door, dry and solid, covered by a canvas tarp that Arthur had apparently anchored carefully enough that it had held through years of weather. She found matches in a tin on the shelf above the fireplace. She built a fire with the focused, methodical attention of someone doing a necessary task, and when it caught and the warmth began to spread into the room, she sat in the chair closest to it and held the notebook and continued reading. She read for most of the morning. Arthur wrote about the years after. The way he had eventually accepted that direct contact was not going to be possible and had shifted his energy into securing the land and the cabin in a legal framework that could not be easily undone. He had worked with a lawyer in a small town called Millhaven, a man named Glenn Whitaker, who had helped him establish a trust with Winifred Ann Calloway, named as the sole beneficiary. The trust had been in place since 1989, 35 years. While she was raising Douglas and selling her house and signing paperwork, she did not fully understand this land had been legally designated as hers, waiting for her protected. Glenn Whitaker also helped me build in a safeguard, Arthur wrote. If anyone connected to you ever tried to claim this property through legal pressure or through persuading you to give it up, there is a mechanism that transfers it automatically into a community trust, with you named as lifetime guardian. I wanted to make sure that what I built could not be taken from you the way other things had been taken. He had known. He had known that the people who redirected his letters were the same kind of people who would look at this land and see an opportunity. And so he had built around that knowledge the way a careful man builds around a known weakness in the structure, reinforcing it before it can be exploited. Winifred set the notebook down and looked into the fire. She was still sitting there when she heard the sound. An engine. Distant at first, then closer, its sound intrusive and entirely out of place among the morning sounds of the forest. She heard it cut off, a door close, footsteps on the path, the particular sound of leather soles on uneven ground, the sound of someone who was accustomed to surfaces that cooperated. She did not move from the chair. Douglas appeared in the doorway of the cabin. He was dressed in the way he always dressed when he wanted to project competence and authority, good clothes, careful grooming. The presentation of a man whose life was organized and intentional. He looked at the cabin interior with the rapid assessing scan of someone who has arrived to evaluate rather than to visit, and then his eyes found her sitting by the fire and something in his expression shifted, recalibrated. "Mom," he said. Winifred looked at her son. There was a time not long ago when the sound of his voice saying that word would have produced in her an immediate reflexive softening, the instinctive maternal response to the specific person she had organized her entire life around. She waited to feel that now and found instead something much quieter and much more solid. She simply looked at him. She saw him clearly. "You found me," she said. He stepped inside his shoes, registering the change from earth to old wood. "I have been looking for you." "We were worried." "Were you?" she said. Not as a challenge, as a genuine inquiry. "Of course we were. You left without a word, without any indication of where you were going. Winifred, you are 70 years old and you were out in the woods alone at night." "I am aware of how old I am," she said. Douglas moved further into the room, his eyes moving around the space again with that assessment quality she had already identified. He looked at the fireplace, the shelf, the notebooks on the floor beside the chair. He looked at the documents she had set on the table. His gaze lingered there a moment longer than it lingered anywhere else. "How did you find this place?" she asked. He looked at her. "I asked around. Someone in the area mentioned there was an old property back through the trees." Winifred looked at him for a moment. "Who?" she said. Douglas shifted his weight slightly. "It does not matter who. What matters is that you are here and that this property exists and that we need to talk about what that means practically. What it means practically, she said. He sat down in the other chair, the one that had belonged to Arthur, and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees in the posture of a man who is about to be reasonable and would like that noted. Mom, this land, do you have any idea what it is worth? This is prime acreage. The development corridor has been moving in this direction for the past several years. What is sitting here as an old cabin in some overgrown forest is worth considerably more than you might expect. Winifred said nothing. We could do something meaningful with this, Douglas continued. Something real. I have connections in the development sector, people who would know exactly how to maximize the value here. We could build something that sets you up for the rest of your life, something that actually takes care of you properly. He said takes care of you in the particular tone of a man who has rehearsed that phrase and believes it will land well. Winifred looked at her son. She looked at him the way she had been unable to look at him for most of his adult life without the protective film of hope and unconditional love that had always slightly blurred her vision where he was concerned. She looked at him as a woman looks at a man she is finally seeing accurately. You did not come because you were worried about me, she said. Mom, you came because someone told you what this land was worth. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. The pause was brief, but it was definitive. There was no version of a genuine denial that would have required that pause. I came for both reasons, he said finally. Winifred picked up the documents from the table and held them in her lap. I went into town 2 days ago, she said. I found the lawyer named in these papers, a man named Glenn Whitaker. I showed him what I found here and he confirmed everything. This land is mine. It has been mine for 35 years, held in a legal trust that predates anything I signed with you by decades. Douglas's expression changed. Not dramatically, a tightening around the eyes, a slight adjustment in the set of his shoulders. That may be, he said, but depending on the structure of the trust and how it interacts with the documents you signed in previously, there may be complications that require professional guidance to navigate. You should not be handling something like this alone, Mom. I am not alone, Winifred said. Glenn Whitaker knows what he is doing. The trust is solid, and there is a provision in it that you should be aware of before you take another step in this direction. She told him about the automatic transfer clause. She said it without emphasis in the same quiet, even tone she had been using throughout the conversation, because the words themselves required no performance. Arthur had done the work 35 years ago. All she had to do was deliver them. Douglas sat very still. He looked at the documents in her lap. He looked at her. He looked at the fire. She could see him working through it, running calculations she recognized, because she had watched him run calculations her entire adult life, always evaluating, always positioning. She had always told herself that was ambition. Sitting here now, she saw it differently. Ambition is what you do when you are building something. What Douglas was doing had always been about positioning himself in relation to things other people built. You are making a mistake, he said finally. Winifred shook her head slowly. I already made the mistake, she said. I made it when I signed papers I did not read because I trusted the person handing me the pen. I made it when I did not listen to my sister when she told me to look more carefully. I made it 40 years ago when I believed a story about a man who never actually left. Something crossed Douglas's face that she could not entirely read. Not quite guilt. Something adjacent to it but more self-protective. He looked at the notebooks on the floor. Who was he, Douglas asked. Someone your grandfather made sure I never knew, she said. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. This one had weight and direction. Douglas looked at his mother and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and in that moment something between them settled into its true form, not the performed version of a mother and son who had always been fine, but the actual version of a woman who had given everything and a man who had taken it in the specific, unsentimental truth of what that meant for both of them. You should go home. Douglas, she said. Her voice was not angry. It was not cold. It was simply finished the way a sentence is finished when it has reached its natural end and there is nothing more that needs to be added. He sat for another moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the door of the cabin. He paused in the frame, his back to her, and she thought for a moment that he was going to say something that mattered. Then he walked out without turning around. She listened to his footsteps recede through the clearing And then she listened to the car door close and the engine start and the sound of it moving away until it was gone entirely, and there was nothing left but the fire in the forest and the particular quality of silence that follows a conversation that has reached its real ending. The cat appeared from the hallway and crossed the room and settled near the hearth. Winifred looked at the notebook still on the floor. She had read most of what Arthur had written. She had not yet found what she now believed had to be there. She reached down and picked up the last notebook, the thinnest of the four, and opened it to the final pages. The last entry was shorter than the others. If you are here, Winifred, then you survived whatever kept you away. That means you are stronger than anything they took from you, and that means you still have a life to claim. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest for a moment, both hands wrapped around it. Then she reached into the chest one more time, pressing her hand into the far corner where the shadow was deepest, and her fingers found something she had missed the first time. A flat envelope lying face down, its edges slightly crinkled. She lifted it out and turned it over. On the front, in Arthur's handwriting, 4 words: "Only open when he comes." Winifred sat very still. Arthur had known. He had known that Douglas would come, that someone would come, that the land would draw exactly the kind of attention it had drawn this morning. He had written the provision into the trust. He had told Glenn Whitaker how to handle it. And he had left this envelope, this additional thing, this final layer of preparation for the specific moment that had just occurred. She turned the envelope over in her hands. The seal was intact. Douglas had come and gone. The moment the envelope described had arrived and passed. She set it on the table in front of her and looked at it in the firelight. Whatever Arthur had left inside it, he had not left it to wound her or to reckon with the past or to ask anything of her. He had never asked anything of her. Every choice he had made across 35 years of silence and building and careful legal preparation had been made entirely on her behalf, without expectation of return, without any certainty that she would ever find her way here. She placed her hand flat on the envelope. Tomorrow she would open it. Tonight she had enough truth to carry. She would let this one wait until morning, until she had slept, and the fire had burned down, and the forest had completed whatever its work was in bringing her to this place. She leaned back in the chair that had been Arthur's chair in the cabin Arthur had built, with his hands on the land Arthur had held for her for 35 years, and she looked at the fire and let herself exist in the full weight of everything she now knew. Outside, the forest was completely still, and the envelope waited on the table, holding the last thing Arthur Hess had wanted her to know. She opened the envelope in the morning, not at first light, not in the dramatic way of someone who has been waiting through the night with mounting anticipation. She opened it after she had washed her face with water from the stream, after she had rebuilt the fire from the coals that had survived the night, after she had sat with her coffee, which was nothing more than hot water, with a handful of dried herbs she had found in a tin on the shelf, and let the morning establish itself around her at its own pace. She opened it when she was ready. That was new. For most of her life, readiness had been a luxury she could not afford. She had moved from one necessary thing to the next, without pausing to ask whether she was prepared for any of it. Readiness was what you arrived at after the fact, looking back. This morning, for the first time and longer than she could accurately calculate, she waited until she was genuinely ready. The envelope contained 2 things. The first was a single folded page in Arthur's handwriting. The second was a smaller envelope sealed with Glenn Whitaker's name and office address written on the front, and a note beneath it in Arthur's hand that said, "He is expecting this. He has been expecting it for several years. Tell him the time has come." She read the letter first. Arthur had written it without a date, which she understood now was intentional. He had not known when she would come, only that the conditions for her arrival would involve someone showing up to claim what was hers. He had written it to arrive after that event, in the quiet that followed. He wrote, "I am not going to ask you to forgive your father. That is your decision, and it belongs entirely to you, and I have no standing to weigh in on it. What I want you to know is that I spent a long time being angry on your behalf, and at some point I understood that the anger was taking up space I needed for something else. I put it down. Not because he deserved that, because I needed the room." He wrote, "The land is yours without conditions. I do not want anything from you in return. I never did. I want you to understand that clearly, because I think the people in your life have made a habit of attaching conditions to things they gave you, and I want this to be different from that in a way you can feel." He wrote one more thing, the last paragraph written in a slightly different pressure of the pen, as though he had set it down and come back to it. I built this place with my hands because it was what I knew how to do. A man who works with his hands understands that the thing you make carries the intention you put into it. Every board in these walls was placed with the specific intention that you would someday stand inside them and feel that someone had made something for you without asking anything back. I hope it feels that way. I hope the walls hold. Winifred folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she stood, put the smaller envelope in her coat pocket, and went to find Harlan Dobbs. She had not seen him since the morning 2 days before Douglas arrived, when he had appeared at the cabin door, and she had shown him the documents, and he had looked at the key with an expression she had not been able to fully read. He had left without explanation, and she had been so occupied with everything that followed that she had not pursued it. Now she understood that she needed to. She found him on the far side of the clearing, at the edge where the trees thinned toward a narrow track she had not previously noticed. He was standing with his weight on his good leg, looking at the cabin from a distance, and he turned when he heard her coming with the alertness of a man who has spent enough years outdoors to register approach before most people would. They looked at each other for a moment. "I owe you an explanation," Harlan said. He did not say it easily. It came out with the specific difficulty of a man who knows the right thing and does not find it simple. Winifred waited. "The Calloway boy," he said. "Douglas. He found me about 4 years ago, said he had reason to believe there was old property in this area that might be connected to his family. He asked me to contact him if anyone came asking questions or showed up at the land. He paid me for it. $200 a year, which is not a large amount, but which I needed because my wife has been sick, and the bills from that kind of sick do not stop arriving just because you have run out of ways to pay them." He looked at her steadily, not asking for absolution, stating facts. "I called him the night I came to the cabin and saw you there," Harlan said. "I told him there was a woman with documents claiming the property. I should have waited. I should have looked at what you were carrying more carefully before I made that call. I knew Arthur for 23 years, and I knew what he was trying to do with this land, and I made the call anyway because I needed the $200 and because I told myself it was not my business." He stopped. The forest was quiet around them. Winifred said, "How did you know Arthur?" "He hired me," Harlan said. "Came to my door one afternoon about 23 years back, said he had land that needed tending, and he wanted someone who would do the good and keep their mouth closed about what they saw. That was all the job description he ever gave me. I cleared paths, kept the cabin from falling apart, made sure nobody squatted on the property or stripped it for materials. He paid me fairly. He paid me on time. When my wife got her first diagnosis, he added a month's pay to my next envelope without a word of explanation." He was quiet for a moment. "He told me once," Harlan said, "that the land was going to belong to a woman eventually, and that when she arrived, I would know it was her because she would have the key. He said to help her however I could. He said that like it was a simple instruction, and I told myself I understood it, and then when it actually happened, I made the wrong call anyway." Winifred looked at him. He was 74 years old, and he was standing in the morning light with the particular posture of someone who has done something they cannot undo and is not trying to minimize it, just acknowledging it clearly, which is a harder thing than most people manage. She said, "Did you know he was going to leave this land to someone specific?" Harlan nodded. "He told me your name. Not at first, but eventually. He said Winifred Calloway. He said it like the name meant something particular to him, like it was the answer to a question he had been carrying for a long time." Winifred absorbed that. She said, "I need to go into Millhaven today. I need to see Glenn Whitaker. Would you drive me?" Harlan looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite relief, but was in the vicinity of it. "Yes," he said, "I would." She handed him the sealed envelope from her coat pocket. She said Arthur left this for Glenn Whitaker. He said Glenn has been expecting it. Harlan took the envelope and looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I will get the truck," he said. Glenn Whitaker's office was exactly as she remembered it from her first visit, small and practical, and organized in the way of someone who understood that their work required precision rather than impression. He was at his desk when they arrived, and he stood when Winifred came through the door with the kind of deliberateness that indicated he had been thinking about this meeting for some time. She handed him the envelope. He sat down, opened it carefully, and read what was inside without expression. Then he set it flat on the desk and looked at it for a moment before looking up at her. "He left instructions," Glenn said. In the event you came, and in the event that someone in your family had already attempted to claim the property he wanted me to take. One additional step. He opened his desk drawer and produced a folder that looked considerably older than the other documents she had seen. He placed it in front of her. Arthur filed a secondary legal notice with the county recorder's office in 1994, Glenn said. It is a matter of public record. It documents the ownership history of the property, the establishment of the trust, and the full legal designation of you as sole beneficiary. He did this specifically so that there could be no private negotiation around it. It is not something that can be quietly contested or worked around through family pressure. Anyone who wanted to challenge this would have to do it on public record with everything that implies. Winifred looked at the folder. He thought of everything she said. Glenn said, he was a thorough man. He came to me every few years to review the documents, make sure everything was still solid, ask if there were any new legal developments that might affect the structure. The last time he came in was 2018. He was not well by then, but he was very clear about what he wanted. She asked, did he ever talk about me? Glenn considered this for a moment with the care of a man who understands that the answer matters. He talked about what he was building. The land, for Glenn said. He talked about it in terms of what he wanted for whoever came to claim it. He wanted them to have something that was fully theirs, no obligations attached, no strings. He was very specific about that. He said the person who would come had spent her life building things for other people, and he wanted her to have one thing that existed entirely for her. Winifred looked at the surface of the desk. He knew it was me, she said. Glenn said simply, yes. The drive back to the cabin was quiet. Harlan drove without making conversation, which she appreciated. She sat with the folder in her lap and watched the landscape move past the window and thought about a man who had spent 35 years maintaining a promise to someone who did not know the promise existed. When they reached the cabin, Harlan parked, and they both got out and stood for a moment looking at the structure. In the daylight, with 3 weeks of Winifred's attention applied to it, it looked different from how it had looked on the first night. The vines had been cleared from the front. The door frame had been straightened. The porch step that had been loose was now solid. Harlan looked at what she had done to the place. He said Arthur built that door frame with a level he carried in his truck everywhere he went. Said a door that was not plumb was a door that was always going to give you trouble. Winifred looked at the door frame. She said it needed resetting. The foundation shifted at some point, and the whole left side had dropped about a 1/4 inch. Harlan looked at her, then at the frame, then back at her. He said, you fixed it yourself. She said it needed fixing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he said next in the tone of someone delivering information they feel has become necessary. Arthur told me once that the person who came for this land would know what to do with it. I thought he meant something grander than that, something obvious. I did not understand he meant exactly this. Winifred looked at the cabin. She said, would you like to continue looking after this property? For me this time. I cannot pay you what he paid you, at least not yet. But I can pay you something, and I can tell you that the terms would be honest ones. Harlan did not answer immediately. He looked at the tree line for a moment at the clearing at the path that led back through the forest to the road. She could see him working through something, not calculating in the way Douglas calculated, but weighing the way a person weighs something they have been carrying at the wrong angle and are trying to find the right position for. He said Arthur told me once that working for him was the most straightforward employment he had ever offered anyone. He said the only thing he required was that the job be done right. He looked at her. He said, I would like to work for someone like that again. Winifred nodded once. She called Nadine that afternoon, standing outside the cabin with the phone to her ear and the forest quiet around her. Nadine answered before the second ring, which told her everything she needed to know about how long her sister had been waiting. She told Nadine everything. Not a summary, not a careful edited version, but everything, including the parts that reflected poorly on her own judgment, including the years of choosing to believe in Douglas past the point where belief was reasonable, including the moment she had dismissed Nadine's warning because she had not been able to tolerate the possibility that she was right. Nadine listened without interrupting. When Winifred finished, there was a silence on the line. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that belongs between two people who have known each other long enough that silence does not require filling. Then Nadine said, Dad loved you. He did. In the way he understood love, which was about control and protection and deciding what was best for you without asking. Winifred said, I know. Nadine said, That does not make what he did forgivable, but I think it makes it comprehensible, which is different. Winifred said, I am not sure I am ready to forgive him. Nadine said, you do not have to be. You just have to decide whether you want to keep carrying it. The conversation went quiet again for a moment. Winifred said, I read something Arthur wrote. He said he put the anger down, not because the person who caused it deserved that, but because he needed the room for something else. Nadine said, that is either the wisest thing I have heard in years or the saddest. Winifred said, I think it is both. She heard Nadine exhale slowly. Come see me when you are ready, Nadine said. There is no deadline on it, but I want to see where this place is. I want to see what he built. I want you to see it too, Winifred said. 3 days later, Douglas came back. She heard the car from inside the cabin and recognized the engine before she reached the window. She stood for a moment, then set down what she was doing and walked to the door and opened it and stood in the frame. Douglas came across the clearing, but this time he was not alone. Petra walked beside him, and slightly behind them, a third person she did not recognize, a man in a well-pressed jacket carrying a leather portfolio with the specific bearing of someone retained for professional purposes. Winifred watched them approach. She did not step back from the doorway. Behind her, without her having heard him arrive, Harlan Dobbs appeared at the corner of the cabin and stood without speaking, a quiet and specific presence. Douglas stopped a few feet from the porch. He looked at Harlan briefly, then back at his mother. He said, we need to talk. We talked, Winifred said. There are legal considerations that were not fully addressed, the man with the portfolio said. He had the practiced tone of someone accustomed to framing things in terms of process. Depending on the structure of the trust and the timing of certain prior agreements, there may be grounds for a claim that deserves proper examination. Glenn Whitaker stepped out from behind Winifred. She had called him that morning when Harlan mentioned seeing a car turn onto the track toward the cabin. Glenn had driven out without being asked twice, which told her something about the kind of man he was. He said, I am Glenn Whitaker. I have represented the interests attached to this property for 35 years. I am familiar with every document relevant to this matter. Please identify the grounds you intend to raise. The man with the portfolio looked at Glenn, then at Douglas with the expression of someone recalibrating. Winifred watched her son. He was not looking at the lawyer. He was looking at her. There was something in his face that she had not seen there in years. Not calculation, not performance, but something raw and less organized. He was looking at the cabin, at Harlan standing at the corner, at Glenn standing behind her, at his mother standing in a doorway she had cleaned and reinforced and made her own. He was looking at something that was not going to move. The man with the portfolio spoke for another 2 minutes. Glenn responded to each point with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been ready for this conversation for a very long time and finds it considerably less challenging than anticipated. When the man finished his final point, Glenn said, any legal action filed against this property will automatically trigger the transfer clause documented in the county recorder's office since 1994. That filing is public record. You are welcome to verify it. If you file, the property moves entirely out of the family's reach in perpetuity. If you do not file, ownership remains exactly as it currently stands. There is no other option. The clearing was quiet. Petra turned and walked back toward the car without speaking. She did not look at Winifred. She did not look at Douglas. She simply removed herself from the situation with the brisk efficiency of someone cutting a loss. Douglas stood for another moment. The man with the portfolio quietly closed it and took 2 steps back, giving Douglas whatever this moment required. Winifred looked at her son. She was not angry. She had moved through the anger somewhere in the long night after she first read Arthur's notebooks in the hours when the fire burned down, and she sat with the full weight of what had been taken from her. Not just by Douglas and Petra, but by her father, by the stories she had been handed about Arthur, by the decades she had spent building her life on ground that had been deliberately undermined. The anger had been there, and it had been real, and it had burned at a proper temperature for the time it needed, and then it had become something else. What she felt looking at her now was more specific than anger, and in some ways more painful. She felt the precise outline of what had been possible and what had actually happened, the gap between those two things, the specific shape of that gap. She felt it clearly and without distortion. She said, I hope the business does well, Douglas. I genuinely do. I hope you build something that matters to you. But I will not be part of it again. And this will not be part of it. This was not mine to give. And even if it had been, I would not give it. Douglas looked at her for a long moment. He said, I know what I did. She waited. He said, I do not know how to fix it. She said, I know. That was all. Not forgiveness, not condemnation. Just the acknowledgement of the distance between where they stood and any version of things being different, and the quiet, honest admission that she did not have a map for crossing it and was not certain one existed. He turned and walked back to the car. She watched him go. She watched the car back down the track and disappear through the trees. She stood in the doorway until the sound of the engine had faded completely, and there was nothing left in the clearing but morning light and bird song and the particular stillness that follows the departure of something that has been weighing on the air. Glenn shook her hand and told her to call him if anything else developed and drove back toward Millhaven. Harlan returned to the edge of the clearing where he had been working on a section of drainage that had collapsed at some point in the previous winter, and the sound of his work, methodical, unhurried, competent, settled into the background of the morning. Winifred went inside and sat at the table. She sat there for a while without doing anything. Not thinking specifically, not processing anything in the deliberate way of someone working through a problem. Just sitting in the cabin in the morning light, with the fire going, and the sound of Harlan working outside and the particular quality of presence that the space had accumulated over the weeks she had been in it. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps at the door, lighter and less certain than Harlan's, and a man appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 55, wearing clothes that had been good quality some years ago, and were now the clothes of someone who had not been paying close attention to such things. He looked at the cabin interior with the expression of someone who had been walking for a while and had arrived somewhere he had not exactly planned. He said, I apologize for the intrusion. I saw the smoke from the chimney. I have been walking in these woods for about 2 hours, and I was not entirely sure where I was ending up. Winifred looked at him. She said, are you lost, or are you somewhere you needed to be? He considered this with more seriousness than the question might have seemed to warrant. He said, I am not sure there is a difference right now. She stood and went to the shelf and took down 2 tin cups. She said, sit down. I will make something warm. He sat. She made the same herb tea she had been making since she arrived, which was not particularly good, but which was hot and which she had found to be adequate to the purpose of giving a person's hands something to hold while they gathered themselves. They sat without speaking for a few minutes. Outside, Harlan's work continued. The fire settled. The man said, I had a job for 22 years. Same company, same desk. They eliminated the position 3 months ago. My wife has been very patient. I have been less patient with myself. Winifred said, what did you do before you walked into a forest? He said, I drove, then I stopped driving, then I walked. She said, and now you are here. He looked around the cabin. He said, I do not know why I stopped here specifically. Winifred looked at him for a moment. She thought about a woman who had followed a cat into the dark because there was nothing left behind her and had ended up in a place that had been waiting for her for 35 years. She said, sometimes you stop where you stop. The reason comes later. He held the tin cup in both hands and looked at the fire. She did not offer him advice. She did not offer him solutions. She simply stayed, which was what the cabin had been doing for 35 years, and which she was beginning to understand was its primary function. He left an hour later, walking back through the trees with a slightly different quality of movement than he had arrived with. She watched him go from the doorway, then turn back inside. Spring arrived in the weeks that followed, the way spring arrives in Tennessee, not all at once, but in a series of increasingly convincing arguments. The cold lost its authority gradually, then definitively. The forest, which had been all bare structure and shadow since she arrived, began to fill in. Green appeared at the edges of things first, then moved inward. Winifred built a garden. It was small, practical, located in the area of the clearing that received the most consistent light. She worked on it in the mornings when the ground was yielding and the light was good. She had found seeds in a sealed tin in the cabin's small cellar, labeled in Arthur's handwriting, mostly vegetables, some herbs. Whether they were still viable, she did not know until she planted them. Several were. The ones that were not, she replaced with what she could find at a hardware store in Millhaven on the occasional supply runs she made with Harlan. She did not think about Douglas while she worked in the garden. She thought about the soil and the seeds and the specific, unambiguous logic of growing things, which is that you prepare the ground, you plant, you tend, and then you wait to see what comes up. There is no shortcut in it and no trick. It is entirely about the work and the patience. Nadine drove up from Nashville on a Saturday in April. She arrived in the late morning and parked where Harlan had shown her at the head of the track and walked through the forest to the cabin. Winifred heard her coming before she saw her and went to the edge of the clearing to meet her. Nadine stopped when the cabin came into view and looked at it for a moment. She said, "He built that." Winifred said, "Yes," Nadine said with his hands. "Yes." Nadine walked around the perimeter of the cabin, slowly touching the walls, looking at the corners, the door frame, the repaired step. She looked at the garden. She looked at the woodpile. She looked at the small, cleared area near the stream where Winifred had built a simple bench from materials she had found in the cellar. She said, "How much of this was here when you arrived, and how much of this is you?" Winifred considered the question seriously. She said, "He built the structure. I have been working on everything since." Nadine looked at her. She said, "You look different." Winifred said, "I have been doing a lot of work with my hands." Nadine said, "That is not what I mean, and you know it." They sat outside that afternoon on the bench by the stream and talked in the way they had not talked in years, not carefully, not diplomatically, but directly, with the ease of two people who have been around each other long enough to have stopped performing and started simply being. They talked about their father, about what he had done, and why, about the difference between understanding something and accepting it. They talked about Douglas briefly, without resolution, because some things do not resolve, they only clarify. At one point, Nadine said, "What happens now?" Winifred looked at the stream. She said, "People have been finding their way here. I do not know how exactly. A man last month and a woman last week who needed to sit somewhere quiet for a while. I have not advertised anything or made any announcements. They just arrive." Nadine said, "And what do you do for them?" Winifred said, "I make them something hot. I let them sit. I do not ask them questions they are not ready to answer." Nadine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is what you have always known how to do. You have just been doing it for the wrong people." The summer came and settled in and became a permanent condition. Winifred grew into the rhythms of the land, the way she had grown into the rhythms of everything she had ever been responsible for thoroughly, without fanfare, with a particular competence that comes from paying close and sustained attention. The cat stayed through the spring and into the summer. It was present in the morning, sometimes at the cabin door, sometimes near the garden, sometimes visible at the edge of the tree line, watching the clearing with an expression of steady proprietary interest. It accepted the small amounts of food she put out for it without enthusiasm, but also without refusal, which she understood to be a form of acknowledgement. Then one evening in late August, when the light was coming through the trees at the specific angle it only reaches in the last hour before it begins to fall, the cat stood up from where it had been sitting near the cabin steps, stretched, with the complete physical commitment that cats bring to stretching, and walked across the clearing toward the tree line. Winifred was sitting on the porch step. She watched it go. It reached the edge of the trees and did not slow. It moved into the shadows of the forest without looking back, its gray and black coat dissolving into the dappled dark, and then it was gone. She sat for a moment in the quiet that followed. She understood. It had come when she needed it and stayed until she did not, and it had known the difference before she did, which seemed entirely consistent with what it had demonstrated since the beginning. She did not call after it. She did not feel the loss as absence. She felt it as completion, which is a different thing. She stood and went inside. The cabin was warm and organized and genuinely hers in all the ways a place can be. Genuinely yours, not through paperwork, though the paperwork existed, but through the accumulated weight of daily presence. The specific arrangement of objects moved to the positions she preferred, the marks left on surfaces by the particular texture of her attention. She sat at the table and pulled toward her the notebook she had been using to keep records. Notes on the garden, notes on the repairs, still needed notes on the people who had found their way to the clearing and what they had needed when they arrived. It was not a journal in the way Arthur's journals had been. It was a working document, practical-oriented toward what was needed. She turned to a new page. She held the pen for a moment. Then she wrote in the same deliberate hand of someone who understands these words will be read by someone important. "If you are reading this, then somehow against all odds you found your way here." She finished writing and capped the pen and sat for a moment in the quiet of the cabin with the last of the evening light coming through the windows she had cleaned until they were properly clear. Then she stood and lifted the floorboard at the foot of the bed and placed the notebook in the hollow beneath it in the same position where the cloth and the key and the photograph had waited for her. She set it down gently and replaced the board and pressed it flat until it sat flush with the boards around it. Arthur had started something in this place 35 years ago. Not just the building, not just the legal structure, not just the careful provisions against the predictable failures of the people she loved. He had started a practice, the practice of building something real, with the specific intention that it served someone who needed it, asking nothing in return, trusting that the right person would eventually arrive. She intended to continue it. Outside, the Tennessee forest moved in the warm evening air, the leaves carrying the particular sound they carry in late summer when they are full and heavy, and the whole system of the place is operating at its maximum capacity, unhurried, complete, deeply, and entirely alive. Winifred Calloway stood in the cabin Arthur Hess had built with his hands, and she looked at the walls that had held through every season since, and she felt without sentimentality and without any need to qualify it that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had been sent, not where circumstances had deposited her, where she had arrived by her own navigation through her own darkness at the end of a path that had been waiting for her to find it. A life can be taken from you piece by the people you trusted most with it. That is a true thing, and it happens, and there is no undoing it. But there is this. There is the moment you realize that what was taken was never the whole of you, only the parts you made available. There is the moment you find what was kept safe. There is the work of your own hands on something real. There is the morning after, and the one after that, and the accumulated weight of showing up every day for a life that is finally entirely and irrevocably your own.